Okay. Good afternoon. Welcome back from your break. If you're joining us for the first time, we welcome you. And if you've been here all morning with us, even better, we welcome you as well. We are sharing our exploration of post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury, and most importantly, the spiritual dimensions of military service, of the combat experience, and the psycho-spiritual holistic dimensions of these wounds we today call PTSD and moral injury. In our first session, we looked at warriorhood and the warrior identity as a sacred identity and looked at the spiritual dimensions of military service and combat. In our second session, we looked at a holistic model for how to work with, treat, and bring healing to our troops and veterans who are suffering both post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury. And for those who didn't hear before, I remind us all that we are working together for a holistic vision. Not just schemes and techniques, there are plenty of those and we share some of those, but for a holistic vision of how all of this material fits together in the complex yet holistic and basically good moral spiritual human beings we strive to be, and we can of course be wounded and break down and lose our paths. So we've come to our third session, and we will focus more tightly now on moral injury and ask the questions. Moral injury. What is moral injury? How does it differ from post-traumatic stress disorder? How can we best understand it and respond to it today? So, to begin, I'd like just you to contemplate the picture on the screen that I have to accompany this opening session. We see two of our veterans. This picture was taken in Vietnam during one of the healing and reconciliation journeys I lead there every year. I've led 14 journeys to Vietnam. My 15th will be this December. And please, if you're interested in considering joining us, please contact me in my office, and we'd be happy to discuss this with you. Well, on this particular journey to Vietnam, you see one of our veterans in the Marine Corps cap is comforting and honoring another one of our vets who's capless. And let me tell you the story because this relates to the difference between moral injury and PTSD. Veteran in the cap, we saw him in an earlier picture. He is one of our Native American warriors, and he was a combat Marine in Vietnam. He needed to go back to help heal both his PTSD and his moral injury. And I could tell many of his stories of that healing that has been quite comprehensive and wonderful, and he is a renewed person and is renewing his community, serving the young veterans on his reservation. The man he's comforting was a Navy officer, a graduate of Annapolis, who was, after graduation and some service, was ordered to Vietnam. This particular man felt so much conflict not about serving in the military, but about the Vietnam War itself. He went into a deep, deep moral anguish. I want to serve my country, I want to fulfill my military obligation, but I am so against this war and believe it is unnecessary and wrong, I don't know what to do. He anguished for a while, and then he finally refused to go to Vietnam, resigned his commission. Now, he has been a teacher and an independent tutor for his 40-year career since that refusal. And he is an example of a person who had moral injury, but not from the combat zone, and he did not have PTSD that accompanied it. So he did not have most of the symptoms we associate with both PTSD and moral injury. He's a good man, he had a marriage, he was not abusing people or substances, but he lived an extremely isolated, marginalized life. From the time that he refused to go to Vietnam, he felt alienated from other veterans and alienated from our country, and in fear that nobody would understand and support his choice. Our Marine veteran needed to go to Vietnam to reconcile with the Vietnamese people. Our Navy veteran needed to go to Vietnam not to reconcile with the Vietnamese because he felt like he had done right by them in not serving his little bit to protest the war and protect the Vietnamese, but rather he felt he needed to be in country with combat veterans and reconcile with them, see if they could understand his stand and if they would accept him as a brother. And you see an image of the result. Our combat veterans not only accepted him, they loved him, they honored him, they listened to his story, and they told him that, in fact, while he was honoring them as combatants, they all said, our circle of about 8 combat veterans said to our one resistor, "You, our brother, had the greatest moral courage of us all. We had to go through combat because we had no choice, but you took a moral stand that you knew was right, protected your own heart and soul, and showed great moral courage." Our Navy veteran came home transformed. He no longer lives marginalized. He is involved in veteran groups and veteran causes. He gives much time, service, mentoring, and money to those causes, and he's come out of his seclusion. So this moral injury was healed by having the corrective experience of going in country in Vietnam today with our combat veterans, telling his story fearlessly and reconciling with them. So this is an example of moral injury, how it can differ from PTSD, and one of the many, many different sources of moral injury. Even trying to do right by saying, "I don't want to go to war," can cause moral injury because of the complex conditions we live under today. Before we go on, I do want to remind everyone listening, please, not only chaplains, but anyone, behavioral health people, mental health people, psychologists, medical community, anybody who's listening, please do email us, send your roster or your own name in to Chaplain Campbell. That's on the screen, ira.s.campbell.mil@mail.mil. Chaplain Campbell was the instrumental force in organizing and offering this moral injury training. And it's very important that we hear from you, know if we're serving your needs, know how many of you are listening, and be together with a head count and with our hearts and minds in unity in seeking this understanding and healing of these terrible, invisible wounds of war. I also want to remind us and say again, today is 9/11, and we do walk together in shared grief over the attacks on our country, the victims lost, the families harmed and traumatized forever from those losses. And during our break, Vice President Biden was on the air also calling for all Americans on this day of national grief to honor all of those that we have lost, fallen, been wounded, visibly or invisibly, in all of our wars since 9/11. So let us take this as a holy day of honor and remembrance, and together share our grief and share our gratitude and honor to all those who have suffered, and to our nation and our shared invisible wounds of war. So we move on in our exploration of moral injury. And I would like to tell you this story briefly. We have many, many stories of veterans from all conflicts who were able to resist moral injury during the combat experience. This one is particularly dear to me because I discovered this painting when I was 10 years old. And this painting, it's a rendition of an incident that happened during the Civil War at the Battle of Fredericksburg. You see Sergeant Richard Kirkland. He was a 19-year-old Confederate soldier from South Carolina. For those of you who remember our Civil War military history, the Battle of Fredericksburg was a terrible bloodbath. The Union forces kept throwing division after division after division against an impregnable Confederate position. And the Confederates slaughtered the charging Union soldiers over a mile-long open plain. Casualties were very, very high on the Union side and quite light, about 1/3 or 1/4 of the casualties on the Confederate side. The Union troops, though they sent thousands of men against the position, they never even reached that stone wall you see. Well, I learned this story when I was 10 years old, and it has inspired me ever since, and it was one of the foundational stories for me that called me to this work and this service with all of you. In fact, I carry a stone. It's just a small stone, but I carry this stone from the battlefield of Fredericksburg, exactly where this story happened, to always remind me that we must treat, respond to, heal moral injury, and in fact, it is possible to resist it even under the most dire conditions. After the attacks against the wall, Sergeant Kirkland, this 19-year-old, was behind the wall with his Confederate comrades, and he heard the moaning, the crying, the screaming of the many, many hundreds of Union troops on the other side of the wall who were technically, formally his enemy. Well, Kirkland approached his officers and said, I want to go over the wall and tend the wounded. They said, well, you'll be shot, but by the other side, do it if you dare, it's up to you, we don't give you permission. He wanted to carry a white flag to show he was on a peace mission. They wouldn't let him because it would look like a surrender flag. So Kirkland, all alone in front of thousands of Confederate troops and thousands of Union troops, scaled that wall loaded with canteens, but no weapons, and he spent hours and hours and hours, as you see in the picture, tending the fallen Union troops. Now, the Confederates behind the wall said, this isn't war, this is murder, as they were shooting down the charging, unprotected Union troops. What we do, and our soldiers do, differentiate between fair fights and murder. Killing when armed soldiers have equal fight is a different matter than just slaughtering unprotected people, even if they're armed soldiers. They called it murder, but nobody but Sergeant Kirkland scaled the wall to answer. And so we might say both sides cheered him when they saw him, but nobody joined them. It was not like the Christmas truce of World War I, where so many troops came out of the battlefield. That too is an example of trying to resist moral injury in the most heinous conditions. But here we might say that the Confederates who say this is murder, the Union who saw their people slaughtered, all took moral injuries, but Sergeant Kirkland had the moral courage and presence of mind and heart and spirit to climb those walls and resist moral injury and in fact create a model for all times. He's known as the Angel of Fredericksburg, and tragically he was killed at Chickamauga less than a year later. But there's a statue on the Fredericksburg battlefield. There is a memorial foundation, and he is a model for doing right under the most difficult conditions and resisting moral trauma. So we ask the question, moral injury is one of our new concepts today. We will see that it is not new, and we'll talk about other sources of wisdom about moral injury. But in our modern time, it has taken a very long time to attend to the moral wounding that troops can and do suffer as a result of modern combat. So why has it taken so long? Well, honestly, we have not asked the right questions. We have not offered the right spiritual, ethical guidance or spiritual, ethical, or cross-cultural frames of reference, and we have not facilitated a complete practice of warrior spirituality. We also, as a nation, and especially tragically from our leadership, we want to continue. We do make wars in ways that harm our own warriors, and we want to continue these same ways, but without the harm. So we have the belief, perhaps an illusion, that we can make war without undue harm, that it's possible to go to war without causing moral injury to ourselves and others, and we want to continue our war-making ways. We'll talk about whether that's possible or not, but that's our national attempt. Continue the wars, reduce the harm, but make war in the same big way. In addition, in our care providing, we do use fear-based models of care. We talk about fear, but for the most part, in most therapeutic techniques, shame and guilt are not targeted. However, of course they are common. Veterans are often told, well, if you want to talk about shame or guilt, go see your chaplain. And so chaplains, they will turn to you for this. But we therapists also need to deal with shame and guilt and understand how much that cripples people. And carrying too much shame and guilt can and often does prevent disclosure of the war stories. So we need to respond to the shame and guilt. And if that leads us into the moral dimensions, so be it. We must go there. Beyond that, we are dominated, our culture and our professions are dominated by medical and pathological models of war wounding. What we call post-traumatic stress disorder has been taken over in its treatment by the mental health community. And many people still do believe it is a mental illness. What we are affirming is that as a changed and transformed identity, our veterans come home saying, we are changed, we are different, but we are not broken people, and in fact, we are more. We are more for what we've done, for what we've experienced. Please understand us and help us embrace the more as well as heal the wounds. So we need to get away from pathology. We need to not pathologize our warriors who are carrying inevitable, invisible wounds. Now, for clinicians out there and for all clinicians, our clinicians in talking about moral injury may feel helpless. They may feel unprepared. They may feel frightened of their own reactions to the horrific stories. And so some clinicians, their techniques say this, but also some clinicians are not comfortable listening to war stories, and they are afraid of secondary trauma to themselves as well. So they may be too frightened of their own reactions and how witnessing the moral conflicts may harm them, and so they may not go in those directions. They also may feel unprepared to deal with moral and spiritual issues, as if we could separate those from our psychological issues. They are really intertwined. And many schools of psychology do look at our higher functions of morality, of mentation, of spirituality, and do include them in our psychological workups, and we all should be doing that. And clinicians also, like any other human beings, may feel judgmental. And consciously or unconsciously, they may have negative reactions to stories they hear, and they may not understand the war zone. And something I would add to this list that isn't on your screen is that very many of our clinicians want to give their therapeutic techniques to our troops and veterans, but do not have military experience themselves or experience in the veteran world. And so they may be unaware and uninitiated and really not yet ready because they're not familiar enough with all of the mysteries and dimensions of military service to be tending it well. Now, to our chaplains, chaplains are the ones we do expect troops to turn to with moral dilemmas, but our chaplains may feel punishment if they serve the prophetic function. Chaplains may want to question or challenge some of the rules of engagement, knowing they do lead to moral injury, but it may be dangerous for them, and some chaplains have been punished for questioning rules of engagement or other matters in the war zone. So they may feel hesitant or silenced as well. So for all of these reasons and others, it's taken us too long to attend to moral injury, but we are finally there and hopefully catching up and doing a better job for our returnees. Let us recognize, however, that moral wounding has been recognized since ancient times as inevitable in the practice of warfare. And as we seek to do no harm, if we say moral injury doesn't happen, won't happen, we are not telling the truth. 2,500 years ago, the Greek tragic playwright Aeschylus, who was a combat veteran, and many of his plays deal with the consequences of combat. 2,500 years ago, Aeschylus said, "The first casualty of war is truth." The first casualty of war is truth. And so when we are healing these invisible wounds, we must restore truth to the military and combat experience. We must allow our troops and veterans to tell us the truth and to tell our nation the truth. And truth-telling is doing no harm. And disguising or lying about the pain and the damage that comes from war and is called moral injury is an obfuscation, a disguise, a lie. Moral injury will be there. It is true, and we need to speak the truth and let our veterans speak the truth as well. So, speaking the truth, many lessons from ancient Greece. Here we have some of Socrates' observations on the soul. Now, we do all study Socrates in philosophy, and he was a great contributor, and he was, in fact, one of the first person in Western civilization to talk in a meaningful way about the soul and what the soul is, what it is in us. Please know, we don't learn this, that Socrates also was a distinguished combat veteran. We know he served in at least 3 major battles of the Peloponnesian Wars, as you see on the screen, and some of what he learned and what he practiced was because he had been exposed to combat. And he did have a distinguished and courageous combat career and was honored as a great combatant, and it was even in his defense that he spoke about his loyalty to Athens and his service as a combatant. Socrates told us, about 2400 BC, he told us, the soul is that in us that seeks to know what is good and true and beautiful, that differentiates good from evil, and that chooses to steer our actions toward the good or the evil, and our souls are improved by doing good and harmed by doing evil. Socrates also said the same lesson Jesus said a few hundred years later, turn the other cheek, love your neighbor as yourself. Socrates taught we must never harm another for harm done to us. So here's one of the early messages, that we should not seek revenge even if we are in the war zone and even if we have lost some of our own, where it may have to fight as he did, but it should not be for vengeance or to do bad unto the other as they have done to us. That we must resist in order to resist moral injury. I'm sorry this is so small. I apologize for squeezing too much on one screen. But here we have it. Moral injury is a soul wound. It is of the moral and spiritual dimensions, as Jesus, Socrates, Confucius, all the great teachers of the spiritual world have taught us. So here are some of the glosses on moral injury that have come from some of our teachers today and also in the past. I do reference my books, War and the Soul and Warrior's Return, and there are large sections in each book on morality in the combat zone, moral injury, how to respond to it, how to treat it, and portraits of troops who have broken down from moral injury, and also portraits of people who had resisted it. So I refer to those. But let's look at the common definition today. The most commonly accepted definition today that tries to be holistic is that moral injury is the lasting psychological, biological, spiritual, behavior, and social impact. You hear? Holistic, psychological, biological, spiritual, social. It affects our whole being. For the impact of perpetrating, failing to prevent, or even bearing witness to acts that transgress our deeply held moral beliefs and expectations. That's the working definition that most of us are using today. I refer you to Jonathan Shea's excellent works, Achilles in Vietnam and Odysseus in America. Shea first used the term moral injury back in, I believe, 1991 when Achilles in Vietnam appeared, and there he defined it as moral injury as betrayal of what's right in a high-stakes situation by someone who holds power. So that power differential, the command ordering an action that caused a moral injury in a troop that had to follow, is necessary in Shea's definition. And of course, we know that happens quite often. One tanker I worked with who was in Iraq combat was ordered to take out a sniper. The sniper was shooting from an apartment building roof. The tanker protested, "The building is full of innocent civilians. If I use my tank to take out that sniper, I'm going to take the whole building down." The commander said, "There are no civilians there, take out the sniper." The tanker said, "I see civilians in their windows hiding. I saw them running into the building for cover." The commander said, "Take out the tanker or else." That's an order. Our tanker did, and he suffered tremendous moral anguish as a result of that action. And it did take us several years of therapy for him to find peace and acceptance for that deed. So there was someone in power. He was ordered to do something he didn't want to do. And another Iraq veteran defines the wound as when your heart tells you to do when your head tells you to do what your heart knows is wrong. When your head tells you to do what your heart knows is wrong, and in the combat zone that's sometimes necessary to save your own and your buddies' lives, but we still have moral injury. Another expert in the field, in a book that is not well known, but I highly recommend it, Robert Maher wrote a fantastic book called Killing from the Inside Out. And he traces the history of the just war doctrine from its beginning to our application today. And he defines moral injury as the violation by oneself or another of a personally embedded moral code or value, resulting in deep injury to the psyche or the soul. That also expresses the depth of pain and suffering and anguish when we go against our own morality. And I have many more quotes here. I don't want to take all the time, but I refer you to these books. Shannon French was a professor of ethics at the Naval Academy, and she wrote an excellent book called The Code of the Warrior. She said, "The warrior's profession puts them at the higher risk for moral corruption because it involves exerting powers in matters over life and death. The warrior's code, and you have the airman's code. What is the warrior's code supposed to do? It's supposed to be moral and psychological armor protecting the warrior from becoming a monster. The code is supposed to protect us and help us maintain moral standards even while in the combat zone. And the Geneva Convention demands that also when it says that if a soldier, any troop, judges a command to be illegal or immoral, he can disobey that command and be protected. Unfortunately, we have not conformed to that tenet of the Geneva Convention, but it's there, and the world agreed on it. So I also refer you to Chaplain William Mahidy's book, Out of the Night. He was a chaplain in Vietnam, and in Vietnam, he said, the essential failure of the chaplaincy was its inability to name the reality for what it was. We should have first called the war sin. In theological terms, war is sin. Chaplain Mahidy is asking us to tell the truth about war. He doesn't say don't do it if we have to, but he does say tell the truth. We refer to St. Augustine's observation, even though he created the just war argument, he also said envy and hatred try to pierce our neighbor with a sword. But the blade cannot reach him unless it first passes through our own body. When we do violence to another, we are inevitably doing violence to ourselves. And again, even if we judge it as right, just, necessary, we are still doing violence to ourselves and changing our identities forever. So the sword goes through us to the other. Carl Menninger, one of our great psychiatrists of American history, he wrote a book called Whatever Became of Sin, trying to bring the spiritual and religious dimensions back into psychology and psychiatry. And he simply said, sin has been converted into either crime or sickness. And that is the condition we're in today, when many of our troops feel they sinned, they committed or witnessed moral injury, and then they are either treated as sick with symptoms by our health establishment or get in trouble and become involved in the criminal justice system. And those are the two dominant systems, unfortunately, working with our most wounded warriors who did experience character breakdown and could not hold their lives or their actions together upon return. So, to summarize a bit, what is moral injury and when do we experience it? We experience moral injury whenever we deny or act against or even witness without taking reparative action against what we know to be good, to be true, to be beautiful. The soul seeks the good, the true, and the beautiful. When we have to act against it and against the deepest affirmations of life itself, we do experience moral trauma. And moral trauma is inevitable. It's inevitable during warfare. We should not lie to ourselves and say we can pass through war without it. Some people can be blessed and not have morally compromising experiences, but war itself is morally injurious and compromising, and we must admit it and prepare our troops to deal with it. And we can do much preventive work by preparing troops with honesty and with courage to face the moral dilemmas that they will experience. Moral injury is also inevitable when we experience either accidental or intentional violence that results in the shattering of the cosmos. Whenever we say, that wasn't fair, life is unfair. Now, we do know that life is unfair in our judgments. We can't see through the divine eyes, but somebody who has a car accident. I worked with a woman who had tragically a series of 4 or 5 car accidents within a few years, and she was shattered. She did not feel safe. She thought life was unfair. Nobody understood why she had fallen apart so much that she couldn't even drive anymore. She experienced the cosmos being unfair and shattering, and she was not safe in this universe, and she had to labor very long and hard to put it back together and feel safe to take life up again. So accidental or intentional violence, not in the combat zone, but in other traumatic incidences, will also cause moral injury. Now, under modern military and social conditions, moral injury will be especially extensive, and troops can experience these conditions as especially unfair. A few of the many conditions we name. Only a few of the eligible are serving. Some people who aren't served do feel concerned and responsible for those who serve. Many don't even notice them or look at them. In a college class on war and spirituality I taught last semester, I had one combat veteran in my class, one survivor of Rwandan genocide, and one ex-felon of 8 years in prison. These 3 were frightened of telling their stories in our class, but in fact, they became co-teachers. The class recognized them, honored them, wanted to hear their stories, and the entire class took the responsibility of witnessing their injuries and helping them cover them. So in that case, though only a few had served or suffered, all 20 or so of my students became people who were serving in the healing of moral injury, and we can transform our communities in this way. Other modern conditions: excessively violent and dehumanizing training. We need to carefully examine the way we train our troops, and I have witnessed trainings where expletives are used, where our troops are told to not think of the enemy as human beings, where they are put down and denigrated and called all kinds of insulting names as our troops are taught to fight to kill them. Dehumanize it. We do not need to dehumanize the other in order to create effective warriors, and other warrior traditions, past and present, do not necessarily do this. It would be far better preventive against PTSD and moral injury if we taught our troops to realize there are other human beings who we may judge to be unjust, evil, bad, and we may even need to have to kill them, but we still understand their cultures and maintain respect for them as human beings. So if I can say to another, I respect you, I honor you as another human being, trying to do the best as you understand it for your culture, but I'm sorry, I do judge that you are a danger to myself and my people, and I have to kill you. If we can come in that attitude, with that attitude, we will significantly reduce moral injury. Multiple deployments, of course, also contribute to moral injury quite significantly. Massive civilian and infrastructure casualties contribute to them. We don't know how many civilians have been killed in Iraq and Afghanistan, but estimates range from the several hundred thousands to over 1 million, and our troops know this. The so-called collateral damage rate has been rising in every war since World War I, where it was 10%, World War II 50%, by Vietnam 75 to 90%, and now in Iraq and Afghanistan in these modern wars, civilian casualties amount for 90% of the casualties, and our troops know this, and they are in anguish. They don't want to harm the wrong people. So under the modern massive technological warfare that wipes out so many people, and under the modern rules of engagement that require unwanted violent actions, moral injury is also inevitable. Further, distant killing without being in direct danger ourselves can cause moral injury, and we know many of our drone operators are experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder and moral injury. They know and they watch the people, and they know their lives, and they know their families. They have the people they're tracking as targets for a long time before they have to take that person out. And sometimes when they take the person out, they have to take many others out as well. Distant killing without being in direct danger has always been questionable in the warrior traditions of the world. Of course, in the modern world, we and all other forces do it, and so we have to explore and expose the dangers and the damage done by distant killing. Lack of civilian involvement and responsibility causes moral injury because our troops are made to carry alone the impact and the consequences of the wars they fight, with the rest of the citizenry having a free ride, not even knowing the consequences, not knowing how our troops suffer, not knowing what's been done in their name. We have to reawaken civilian involvement, and everybody has to carry the burden of warfare together. We also have moral injury resulting from questionable missions motivated by anything other than pure and truthful defense. So when we say we are going to war to protect the American way of life, that may or may not be a morally justified for taking life. We have to leave it up to each troop to determine that. Many troops come home. They came home from Iraq. Some come home from Afghanistan saying, I went over to serve as an honorable American warrior, but when I was there, I saw there were no weapons of mass destruction. I saw the profits the corporations are making. I saw what's going on behind the scenes that motivated these wars. So I went as an American warrior, but I came home feeling like I was only a mercenary for corporations. We have to also be truthful about this and look at this difficult fact of our modern wars and help our troops with moral injury resulting from that. And finally, abandonment, neglect, and betrayal upon homecoming. As we have said many times, homecoming can be the most traumatizing and difficult of the events, and moral injury certainly happens to troops who feel, I served my nation well, I should be cared for by my nation. Why aren't people and our care systems taking care of me and listening to and healing my pain? All these cause moral injury. All these are the modern conditions we are struggling with. And as one of our vets said, no matter how many medications you give me, medications don't heal this kind of pain. Now, I have a long lesson for us that I'm only going to have to fly through because of our limited time on this matter. But what I want to demonstrate, we're talking to everybody out there, chaplains, social workers, psychologists, of course, but let us look a bit for a few minutes at our Judeo-Christian tradition and the heritage we carry, and especially the heritage our chaplains are expert in, because the Bible, Old and New Testament, is full of evidences of trauma, war trauma, and of moral injury, and guidance for protection against it. This recognizes that the sources of our moral injury, teaches us how to respond. And this is our universal heritage as warriors. We all know these things in the core of our being because we've been raised in Western civilization, even if we're unaware of the specifics. So first, let's look at Saul and David briefly. They were both traumatized warrior kings, both of them. They both had PTSD and moral injury. I do full case studies of Saul and David in my book, Warriors Return, and I advise you to look at that. But for now, just let's recognize their trauma. In Saul, the Lord's Spirit left him, and an evil spirit sent by the Lord tormented him, and he raved in his house like a madman. PTSD and moral trauma. And David, half of his 150 Psalms are songs of anguish. And I put up an excerpt from Psalm 22. Why have you forsaken me? Help does not come. I am not a human being. I am a worm. Rescue my soul from the sword. This is a psalm of the anguish of war trauma that David struggled to carry. We have many biblical precepts and stories on how to minimize moral trauma and the wounds of war, and I have chosen many excerpts for you. We don't have time to go through them all. But when Abraham went to war, he declared that he would not take any spoils, that we should not profit from war or from the suffering of others, or else we can always be accused that we didn't go to war for the wrong reasons. We went for riches. Later on, Jacob, on his deathbed, was asked to bless all of his 12 sons, and he cursed 2 of his sons, not bless them, Simeon and Levi, for using their weapons to commit violence, for killing people in anger, for killing bulls for sport. He said, your anger is too fierce, your fury is too cruel, I cannot bless you. He saw them as traumatized, morally injured. Those are all from Genesis. In Numbers, we are given very much guidance about how to tend our warriors, how to reduce and prevent trauma and moral injury. In Numbers 19, we are told of the red cow ceremony, which was a week-long ceremony with purification with ashes, burning herbs, and sacred waters. Very similar to what Native Americans and other indigenous cultures around the world have always done. The Judeo-Christian tradition, had this week-long sacred ceremony in ancient times for all Israelite warriors returning from the battlefield. We could do such ceremonies and give such downtime in sacred space today, and we would save immense suffering and actually millions of dollars of long-term costs of care and disability. We also have to know that people are mature enough to go to war, and in Numbers we're told that men must be 20 years old to be fit for military service. And that was a time when people didn't live very long. So we need to look for maturity. And we also know from modern psychology that the brain keeps maturing until the mid-20s, keeps changing. And so when we send young people, 18 and around that age, off to war, they're still adolescents, their brains are still changing, and so their brains are evolving in the war zone, and they will be shaped differently forever. We refer to the Mosaic command of purification after battle. Moses commanded it, Eleazar, his priest, commanded it. There were special duties required of officers. They had to make special payments and sacrifices for surviving on behalf of all of their people as well as themselves. And there had to always be ritual purification after killing, because murder defiles the land. In Numbers it says only the death of the murderer can purify the land. We do not want to put people who have killed to death. Of course, we do differentiate capital punishment and struggle to decide whether we should allow it at all, but this relates to warriors as well, of course. We want to bring our warriors home. Some of them may feel like murderers, and we want to lift that curse off their hearts and souls. We have more precepts on healing from wounds of war. I refer you all to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 20. It's short, but it seems to be like a Geneva Convention of the Old Testament with many rules for practicing humane warfare and reducing moral injury. It prohibits destruction of nature. The trees are not your enemies. It teaches us to rely on faith and purpose rather than advanced weaponry. It protects the newly married, farmers, new fathers. There are many precepts that tell us who should or who shouldn't, who is ready and who's not ready to go to war, and what we must do. Let's look at that again and compare that to our standards of recruitment and enlistment today. We're also told the camp must be ritually clean. We are told again who can serve and who should not yet serve. And in Samuel, where we hear the stories of David and Saul, we are told to remain pure before battle and to never kill without cause or for revenge, and to never do anything in battle which you will later regret. Well, our troops are doing things in battle today under modern battlefield conditions, and it may be impossible in urban environments thick with thousands and thousands of people and enemies, foes fighting us in those urban environments and hurting their own people as well. How do we act as warriors and without cause or do anything we won't regret? It is exceedingly difficult, but we still need to train our people to hold on tightly to the moral high ground and do as little harm and practice as much protection, honor, and respect of the other as is possible under these difficult conditions. Psalms and Proverbs also give us a lot of direction. And again, we could look at many of the Psalms, and I chose Psalm 7 because in this case, David cried out to God about moral injury. If there is wrong in my hands, if I have requited my friend with evil, if I have plundered my enemy without cause, or we could add, for the wrong causes, then David said, let me be trampled to dust. Let my soul be laid down. David says it would be better to die than to commit moral injury against sacred precepts and sanctions. We need to consider that and, again, protect our troops in every way possible from the necessity in the modern war zone of committing those deeds that we regret or going off to battle for the wrong reasons. And again, we could read Proverbs and find many, many, many quotes about what causes moral trauma, but I chose Proverbs 9, very well-known verse, but think about this. Many of our troops do come back saying, we were haughty. We went to Iraq based on some lies. We shed innocent blood. Some of our commanders or we ourselves had wicked thoughts, and we rushed off to do this war, whether it was right or wrong. We have given false witness by disguising the truth, by not being allowed to tell the truth, and we sometimes turn against brothers and sisters and are too anxious to take up arms, but before we've exhausted all other means. So I don't judge. I never judge our troops. I always ask them to reveal their judgments of themselves. I keep my politics to myself, but we do rely on the spiritual lessons of the past and ask them how they feel and how they judge their actions, their behaviors, and their service that they had to give, and the degree to which it does or does not conform to these ancient spiritual precepts. And I want us to know, we can only look at this briefly, but moral trauma in warriors, again, has been recognized around the world and throughout time as inevitable in the war condition. So we've mentioned the Lakota before. The spirits leave him. To the Hopi, what we call trauma was called a mind frozen in terror, and that person, that mind, had to be relieved of the terror and learn to live unintimidated by it. We mentioned the Navajos, that they had aggressor warriors and defender warriors. Only the aggressors experienced moral trauma. And so we see again, just like with the Vietnamese, that aggression causes far more trauma than defense. And if we are purely and truly being defensive, it is a protection against moral trauma. So we have to be extraordinarily cautious about when and how we wage war, and be sure it is for purely defensive reasons. The Koreans have the concept of Han, an injustice that must be set right in the soul. The Maori have Tapu, very similar, sacred being in us, and whenever violence is committed, Tapu becomes negative and has to be set right by healing those harmed relationships. And in the African traditions as well, the warrior traditions had these concepts there as well. The Tsotsa of South Africa called it Kuneni. It was the warrior's insight into the depth and the burden that follows him. And Ukubulu was public confession. The Truth and Reconciliation Commissions in South Africa were modeled on this practice. Everyone has to tell the entire community what they did, no matter how difficult. The community has to tolerate the pain, no matter how difficult. And if the wrong is confessed and the community carries the pain together, then the person is reintegrated in the community. These can be models for healing today. And they were in South Africa. We can use them for ourselves as well. Of course, we have to mention the New Testament. Many people troops have used the New Testament to strengthen them through combat, and they have seen Christ's suffering in the soldiers. I have a long excerpt from a poem from World War I by Siegfried Sassoon, saying that the soldiers that were struggling in the mud and blood of the trenches, carrying those heavy wooden planks to reinforce their trenches, to him looked just like Christ. He saw Christ in the soldiers. A Korean veteran, on the other hand, who was very, very disillusioned, said, and Vietnam veterans quote this, to Jesus, "Get down off the cross, we need your wood. Forsake the spiritual, just give us this material so we can try to use it for war material and protect ourselves." That was a statement of despair. And to our modern Air Force, one of our Air Force chaplains told me that she was in hospital in Afghanistan, and she looked on a wounded Afghani child. She saw Jesus in that wounded child, in that child's eyes. She and the child had a profound spiritual connection, and she saw the suffering of the Savior in that child. But she tried to tell her comrades, including some other chaplains, and she said, no one believed me. And that was a worse wound than even seeing the suffering of the child, because the child and I were joined under Jesus' model and name in embracing suffering, but I couldn't find anybody among my military comrades who would believe me and experience child's suffering as the Redeemer's suffering. So, from ancient times to the present, and in every war, we do see how moral injury unfolds. So, we have the question of PTSD and moral injury. And what is the difference? Now, we'll talk about this more later, but please remember, we have the same symptomatology. People are breaking down in the same way. The same set of symptoms, the same substance abuse, rebellion against authority, mistrust, alienation, lack of integration, inability to come home, insomnia, nightmares. Is this the same wound or a different wound? Honestly, in the psychological and clerical world, the jury is out. Many people are saying it's the same. Many people are saying it's different. And it's very hard to unravel. But we can point to this difference, this key difference. PTSD causes character breakdown. Moral injury causes character breakdown. PTSD is born of the vulnerability and victimization of powerlessness and suffering. PTSD, the trauma and the wound, belongs to the climactic moment. It's a narrow escape from death. It's seeing its relentless exposure to the threat of death. It's the catastrophic loss of beloved beloved comrades. And all this comes down to extreme powerlessness under the gargantuan forces released in the universe by war. Moral injury, in contrast, is the offspring of great power and its abuse and its infliction on others. It is the legacy of deeds, and war is its most fertile killing ground. We must admit, war is about killing and destroying, about dominance over other human beings when the powers of life and death are put into our hands. And no matter how just, how high-minded the cause or the intention, and even how hate-free our hearts are, there is a moral price that all involved and all nations must pay. We read this in books from ancient times, modern, from the Bible and the Tao Te Ching and Confucius and Homer, all the way to our newest clinical books. Much more importantly, we hear this from our veterans. And I have searched my mind, as I said before. I cannot, in my 40 years of work with our vets and troops, I can't think of anyone who wasn't disturbed by the moral dimensions of war and needed to struggle with what was good and bad, right and wrong, and their place in it. So, we have PTSD, we have moral injury, and PTSD has become a popular acronym. Everybody knows it. It's in the media all the time. It's not only the specialist term. The same thing happened in World War I with shell shock. There were more technical terms, but when shell shock was introduced into public vocabulary, everybody used it. And it became widespread and widely used as a contemporary, at the time, contemporary name for the soldiers' breakdown. So, are they the same? Are they different? PTSD has become a euphemism. It's what we now call the comprehensive and the holistic wound of war and service that has been known since ancient times, but in our contemporary practice, including clinical practice, it has been emptied of its moral, religious, spiritual, and communal dimensions. And instead, we call it sickness or crime, and it's been relegated to the arenas of the medical and mental health and criminal justice systems. And we need to take it back, not take it away from them, but work in collaboration with them so that you chaplains and everybody in the faith communities and all people, all our Americans, are involved in the response. When the community abandons the warrior and forsakes this responsibility for the actions and the warriors that were done in the community's name, then the individual is abandoned, feels broken, and collapses into an individual condition that we then diagnose and treat as if it were an individual pathology, when it truly, truly is a condition that belongs to us all. So finally, we're going to return to King David for a moment. And please stay with us. Our chaplains will come up. We'll have our panel discussion again. And we also then will continue discussing many of the things we can do about moral injury together. But for now, let's remember that Saul was destroyed by his trauma. He committed suicide on his own sword on the battlefield when he felt utterly God-forsaken and didn't believe there was any chance for him to recover or for his people to triumph. King David, on the other hand, did often transcend his moral trauma. And while we have Psalm 22 of an utterly God-forsaken person, we have Psalm 23 of someone who has been healed through the spiritual movement. I can walk through the valley of the shadow of death, fear no evil, and know Spirit is with me, and God's rod and staff comfort me. So let us remember this together, and chaplains and behavioral health people all work for this together. We need each other. Healing from moral trauma comprises a psychological, spiritual, communal movement. From the conditions of King David in Psalm 22 to the conditions in Psalm 23. We are working together for the movement from despair to hope, from absurdity to meaning, from soul distress to restoration, from spiritual emptiness to fullness, from suffering as David practiced, to gratitude and praise, and the restoration of faith. And again, even if we are humanist or atheist, faith means being filled with hope, with goodness, that we live in a universe in which we are at home and in which the good in all of us can triumph. And we can, even if we don't believe in a deity, we can still establish a moral order based on the best of human wisdom, compassion, and love. In all of these ways, we can lead our people to healing both from PTSD and moral trauma. So, thank you very much for listening this hour, and now I'm glad to welcome my sister and brother chaplains back up to the podium for some questions and discussion of important concerns that you've sent in.
Thank you, sir. It's glad to be back with you again and with Chaplain Little during this time frame. To follow up with you on what you were just talking about in regarding PTSD and moral injury, can you tell me of, just go into a little more detail on similarities and differences between the two?
Sure. It's very important, and we're all struggling to differentiate this. So it's really important that we recognize that the similarity is great, because under any form of trauma, human beings, and as we said earlier, some animals will break down with the same characteristic symptoms. So when we look at the list of symptoms and the results for PTSD, they're really the same as moral injury. We have nightmares, we have flashbacks, we have sleep disturbances, we have hypervigilance, we have insomnia, we have, well, the animals don't practice substance abuse. So there are some differences, but we have sexual abuse, and that's been observed in the animal kingdom in traumatized animals. We have turning against our own families and children, which is also observed in animals. The entire social network breaks down when some of the animals or human animals are traumatized. And so the great similarity is in the type of symptomatology and the erosion of character that results. That said, a key difference, as we are emphasizing in that, is that PTSD, we say, is primarily the result of the exposure to violence and horror and the possibility of we ourselves and our unit, our battle buddies, being lost. And so we don't have to have been engaged in any kind of morally questionable actions to have post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's the threat to life, the immediate and severe threat that we could be wiped and our loved ones could be wiped out of existence, that can lead to PTSD. And moral injury really is resulting from witnessing or participating in or failing to take action to prevent wrongful deeds. And so we do feel that it is our actions that have defined us. There's a very good book from the Vietnam era called The Short Timers by a vet. The movie Full Metal Jacket was made off this novel. Our combat survivor Vietnam veteran said over and over and over again throughout the book, what you do, you become. What you do, you become. What you do, you become. He had moral injury, and he said, since I killed civilians, since I went berserk, that must be what I am. It defines me. It's an existential definition that we are defined by our actions, and moral injury exists in that realm. What I do or fail to do when I should have done other is what I become. All that said, I really cannot differentiate, and I don't want to say, while we can say the causes are different, the symptomatology is the same, I do believe that what we call PTSD is the wound emptied of its moral and spiritual and communal components, as if we could look at it as an individual pathology. But when we add the morality and spirituality in, and as I said, after 40 years of work with our troops and vets, every one of them talks about this. So I would say the moral injury and PTSD do travel together, and what we can do is differentiate the sources and the causes. And be careful when we look at the presentation because the presentation is the same, and the symptoms can be a danger that misguides us in how we diagnose and treat.
Thank you. So when we look at the warrior trauma, do you see that there might be a connection between moral injury and secondary trauma, such as vicarious traumatization?
Yes, that's an important question, and for sure that can happen. And for those of us out there who may not have heard the phrase secondary trauma or vicarious traumatization, it's when you're watching, when you're on the sidelines, when you're involved in some kind of relationship, but you didn't do the deeds. Can you be traumatized by that as well? And the answer, tragically, is a strong yes. If I see somebody assaulted and don't do anything to stop it, I will morally injure myself. I saw a man, when I was a teenager, I saw a man collapsed in the subways of New York City. And I tried to find a cop, but I didn't find a cop. And nobody else was doing anything. Everybody else was stepping over the body. This is almost 50 years ago, and I still remember it, and it's a moral injury. I didn't find a cop, and instead I went to my job rather than keep looking for help for that collapsed person. So there's vicarious traumatization. But in a much larger and more penetrating sense, many of our chaplains report secondary trauma in trying to deal with moral injury. One chaplain who was on the front, don't know what you call it. He was downrange in the sandbox, and he was the last person our troops talked to as they went out to their FOBs. And he talked to, I saw his notebooks, he talked to over 3,000 troops. He wrote down their names. He wrote down where they were from, and he blessed them. And he cried and cried afterwards and said, I didn't know what else to do. I don't know if I did them any good. They were going off into the war zone. Many of them maybe came back wounded. Maybe some of them didn't come back. My moral trauma is I didn't know what to do, and I don't know under those conditions what is doing enough. Another chaplain who was told he had PTSD, but always said, I don't. His moral injury was that he was against the war. He was a lifer, he was a lieutenant colonel. When we went to Iraq, he didn't want to go, and he himself judged that war as false. He never believed there were weapons of mass destruction. He thought he should resign his commission like that Navy officer did, but he didn't. And he was in conflict. The moral high ground is to support our troops and go overseas, but the moral high ground is to say no and protest a war I consider immoral or illegal. So he silenced his prophetic function, one of the two functions of the chaplains, didn't speak out against the war, and chose to go. And he said, and then he experienced many of the symptoms we're talking about. People told him he had PTSD, and it took him years to explain and the concept of moral injury to surface for him to say, now I can name my wound. It was a moral injury. And it's from my vicarious traumatization of seeing what was going on, not doing any of the bad deeds, but not raising my voice in protest against it. And one more thing, many non-veterans, older non-veterans of my age. Sorry, young folks.
Oh.
You too, you're young and beautiful.
Oh. Well, thank you, sir.
Well, it's true. You're welcome. But many non-veterans of the Vietnam era, it will happen later on to this generation. Vietnam vets are reporting extraordinary numbers of non-veterans coming up to them and apologizing and saying, I'm sorry for the way we treated you upon homecoming. Some of them are confessing, protesting the vets or spitting on them and apologizing. And many of them who didn't do that are saying, even though I didn't believe in that war and don't like war, I should have been there by your side. So actually, and truthfully, my entire generation, the Vietnam generation, took huge moral injury from that war because there was no way to come out clean. Serving, not serving, was not clean. Perhaps the people who were in the Peace Corps or who gave much of their lives to the anti-war movement, maybe they feel morally clean, and we should hear from them. But it is endemic to the generation that there's moral injury, and both on the individual level of watching and doing nothing, or listening to the stories, or on the collective level of not standing against the war, or not serving as when your time comes in some form, that they all cause moral injury from secondary or vicarious traumatization. Thank you, Chief.
Dr. Tick, I want to thank you again for the extraordinary use of so many interfaith sources for approaching this subject matter. And we've got an interesting question from the field about the future of treatment for PTSD and moral injury. So one question for you to consider: what do you see as the bleeding edge of moral injury treatment? And by this we mean any very new, emerging, or experimental approaches that we have not seen widely employed yet.
Well, I'd like to briefly mention some of the new approaches, and also, as we share, some new applications of old approaches, because both are important and both can be useful in addressing both PTSD and moral injury. So, around the country, there are numerous, especially in faith communities, faith ministries or veteran ministries springing up. So churches, synagogues, mosques are tending to our veterans, praying for the families when they're over there, supporting, or the troops when they're over, supporting families at home, and practicing talking circles, truly making Veterans Day and Memorial Day sacred holidays, creating specialized liturgy for these days, having the entire congregation, veteran or not, perform these sacred liturgies and honoring these as true warrior holidays, warrior holy days that everybody should listen to. And if we could only shut down the malls and not have sales on those days, I'm proposing some transformational movement for our country, or have those stores that have the sales donate their profits to veteran care, since they're making money off veteran holidays. That's bleeding edge. And we call to you, the corporations out there, to give more to our troops and our veterans and be in better partnership with our military. You use them to sell beer and insurance. Don't use them in profit off our troops. Give them money back for their care. I did reveal some of my politics and values. Beyond that, there are new therapies like, as we've mentioned, equine therapies, animal therapies. There are some of the therapies that are meant to correct and repattern our brains. So all of these are new and emerging and are gaining more widespread acceptance. Yoga is being used and Reiki in some of our veteran hospitals, and so we're bringing in holistic methodologies that do change our cerebral functioning and our nervous system functioning. So there are many new things that we need to keep pulling in and consider more holistic. At the same time, the old experiential practices really work, and I will give many examples of them in our final hour. But the holidays, talking circles, altars, memorials for the dead, elders teaching the young, all work. Pilgrimage works, pilgrimage to sacred places, to American warrior sites, to join the American warrior tradition. As I said, I lead pilgrimage back to Vietnam every year, and people come home transformed after 2 or 3 weeks back. I know some chaplains who are leading pilgrimage to Rome. And 2 chaplains I know lead pilgrimage to Rome for chaplains who have been overexposed to trauma and moral injury. And they also report fantastic healing results when our chaplains can be in their most sacred places, pouring their hearts out to God in circles of other chaplains. So both new and old techniques can be used. The main thing is that we have the will and the courage to try both new and old things and apply them to this modern suffering that we all carry.
Thank you for that. I know that we're almost out of time. We have only a very small amount of time to give to this question, but we did have a question about the way chaplains and chaplain assistants can work more closely with behavioral health specialists. At our guard units, at many of them we have a director of psychological health, and we have other on the Reg-AF and regular Army folks who deal with behavioral science, people of various stripes. What could you tell us about how the chaplain core career field can work more closely with these mental and behavioral health experts?
Well, of course, many of our chaplains are trained in pastoral counseling. What I've been told, I'm not sure of the accuracy or if it's cross branches, but about half of our chaplains have pastoral counseling training and half are only trained in their religious denominations but don't have the pastoral care. That is to say that chaplains and behavioral health people really can train each other. That we have different languages, different concepts. I'm honored to have a foot in both worlds and to practice spiritual healing and psychological, clinical healing as well. So I can talk both languages. But chaplains need to become comfortable and educated in the psychological world, and mental health people need to become educated and comfortable with the moral and spiritual dimensions. And we do find that we have different terms for what might be the same experience. So chaplains will talk about soul loss. Psychologists will talk about dissociation. When we present that to the troops, if you tell me I'm dissociated, it sounds like I'm damaged and I'm broken and I'm defensive. If you talk to me about my soul being wounded, it sounds like I've been wounded in my deepest core. Soul talk works better than clinical talk with the survivors. It doesn't mean that the clinical work is inaccurate, but rather that soul talk is more accessible, including if the soldiers need to use 4-letter words to express themselves. We may not like it, but we need to tolerate it and understand that's the deepest expression that's coming out of them in a spontaneous way. Ideally, we want our psychological health people and our chaplains to be equal members of the treatment team, working together with mutual respect and understanding for the benefit of all. And since we do have psychological evaluations and assessments, I believe we should also offer side-by-side spiritual evaluations and assessments, have both involved in our veteran treatment, use them both, cross-reference and cross-consult with each other to make sure we're working together as a team to benefit our troop. And I know for some this means taking on more power than they've had in a while, and for others it means relinquishing some of the power we've had over the clinical situation. And I'm sorry, we don't want a power war, a power struggle, but we do want all of us to be operating in collaboration with each other for the benefit of our troops and our nation. So let's do everything we can together to create this teamwork on behalf of our troops, veterans, and nation, and heal these wounds together in one united and loving effort.
Thank you for that.
Welcome, and thank you both for the beautiful spiritual service you give. And all of you out there, thank you, bless you, and we do begin at that 15-minute break. We'll be together again at the top of the hour, 1600, to begin our final session. And we will offer very specific practices during the final session that we can use for healing moral injury. So rest, break, and come back soon. Thank you.